So it's a great pleasure to be here. I know it was a major effort from the side of the organizers to have me here. Getting the visa was complicated. My life is quite complicated. My job is in Australia. I have 2 daughters in Italy. So I asked first Olga to send me the paperwork for the visa in Rome, but then I missed the Rome appointment, so she sent it back to Australia. It was big holiday season in Russia, so they told me your passport will be ready for May the 30th. And I said, this looks difficult because I have to speak on the 23rd of May. And so I really thank you. I mean, you have been amazing these days in the level of hospitality, welcoming, at the same time, the efficiency of this perfect machine that is this conference. So it's a great pleasure for me to speak here. I have to say the place is slightly intimidating, to use a euphemism, and we are sort of dispersed in a way that my eyesight capacity, I'm not sure who is in the back of the room, but given that, I will try to convey a meaningful talk, hopefully. So as you can see, my talk covers a very long historical arc, which is something that people would tell you today it's very amateurish to do, and it's not what an academic should do, would be to specialize in very narrow areas of research. But I still believe that having a sort of broader picture of contemporary phenomena and trace them back to an older history, although you may lose something in terms of historical fine-grained details for the present, you gain a lot in terms of looking at continuity. So I'm very much inspired by, for instance, French historians who worked on the notion of longue durée, so the idea that historical processes sleep deeply historically beneath the surface, sometimes they comes again over the surface, and this is what I claim is happening in contemporary biology. So to make, is that okay, the microphone? Yeah? To cut a long story short, my claim is that what is happening today, which is illustrated by this picture, that we no longer believe that our gene and genome is closed, walled off from environmental influences, but we do believe that it's heavily shaped by a number of social factors that are here symbolized by food, diet, stress, drug, financial status, the microbiome, social interactions, disease exposure, etc. This notion is certainly a new notion. It's a notion that is coming out because we know now in the lab molecular mechanisms, molecular pathways that in a new way are establishing our genome functioning. It's not just the self-replication of DNA, but there is more than that, and there is a wider architecture from the cell to the whole body to the whole society that shape genomic functioning. So these mechanisms are new. Biological plasticity is a new mechanism. But the philosophical problem, the anthropological problem, the biopolitical problem of how to live with a permeable body, with a body that is shaped constantly in everyday life by a number of environmental factors, and I use environmental in this way because the notion of environment is quite a modernistic one, and I will try to say why there could not be an environment before the 18th century. This notion of living with a permeable body, govern a permeable body, being anxious about a permeable body, being anxious about being penetrated by external influences, is such an old notion in the history of the body and the history of medicine, not only in Greco-Roman medicine, that is my sort of area of more expertise that I will talk today. This is a bit a Eurocentric talk. You could have a similar talk looking at Ayurvedic medicine, and it would totally make sense. A longer history of plasticity from the point of view of non-Western medicine would make sense. And this is why I moved to Australia and have currently this grant with India and South Africa, because I believe that I want to trace these emerging notions of plasticity in non-Western context. So my point is that, this is quite complicated because we have 2 microphones. I have also 2 kind of glasses because I'm in that age where I'm too young to have just one multifocal, but too old to have just one glass. So it's complicated. But okay. So let's start from what is the literature nowadays in the social comments on emerging disciplines in molecular biology, especially environmental epigenetics, behavioral epigenetics. So in a nutshell, environmental epigenetics studies all the wider environmental factors, diet, toxins, socioeconomic status, stress, trauma, etc., that may have an impact on genomic regulation, and according to some, can also be transmitted from one generation to another because the resetting of okay, third microphone. No, thank you. I look like Michael Jackson in this way. Okay, so what I was saying. And for some author, they are believed to go also from one generation to the other. The most famous epidemiological study we have is the long-term effects of the Dutch hunger winter, the Nazi siege of Eastern Holland in 1944, how it is believed that this epigenetic mutation occurred because of the nutritional shock have been transmitted even to the second generation, creating long-term metabolic disorder in a number of people who come from parents who were in utero during the first trimester at the time of the occupation. And of course, there are many studies like that, although they are controversial. But this is to say that we have an emerging area of interest around the fact that the environment can go much deeper than we believed. It's just not physiological responses, but it's shaping the way the genomic architecture really works, and some of these effects can be translated to a next generation. This is the sort of nutshell point of epigenetics. So what social commentators are saying about this? They are saying things like that the life sciences today are generating a transformative view of the biological body as permeable to its environment and therefore plastic. Development is open and malleable. And again, you have to measure this statement against what was said like in the 1970s with the sociobiology debate, in the 1990s with the evolutionary psychology debate, in the late 1990s with the rise of the Human Genome Project and the notion that we could take all our genetic information and put this in a CD that would be myself. So this notion of a self-contained genomic expression is very much deployed and is very much disrupted, by this kind of arguments. So another point by neuroscientist and epigeneticist Michael Meany, the environment gets inside the body and makes the boundary of the skin of little significance. So again, an emerging notion that this self-bounded body of biomedical medicine is being challenged by these emerging notions of environmental epigenetics. The body is seen as coalesced inseparably with environmental forces from the moment of conception throughout life. So again, this is the kind of social comments around the emergence of environmental and behavioral epigenetics, but other disciplines like microbiomics would work as well. And this is what my historical talk is trying to say, as I had anticipated before, that firstly, we should not be dazzled by the apparent novelty of today's view of a body deeply shaped by environmental forces and open to outside influences. So the idea of what we call today biosocial plasticity and what this biosocial plasticity invites different disciplines to collaborate together, was the topic of our conversation on Friday morning. If in a lab you now have to study genomic regulation, for which you need to know variables that are socioeconomic factors, you of course need more than biology to be a biologist. This is why biosocial collaboration is emerging. But my point is that all this, the apparent novelty of bringing together disciplines and thinking of the body as plastic and open needs to be reconsidered. As I was saying before, the molecular mechanisms are new, but the ethical problem of how to live with a permeable body is not. And importantly, this knowledge of a body plastic to environmental forces has never been innocent or disconnected from wider political considerations. So I will show in particular how the knowledge of plasticity can easily nurture arguments about differential openness to the environment in different social groups or gender, and reproduce idea of racialized, gendered, or classed hierarchy. So this is another thing that it's important to understand. Often epigenetics, especially in Anglo-American context, is sold to the public as a rosy message that is no longer truth, that DNA is our destiny, but we can change our genes. So this means that there is optimism and hope. And of course, at some level, this is understandable. But at another level, there is a deeper history about how this idea of environmental determination has been used to make differential argument about different social groups being particularly exposed to certain environments, or women being particularly transparent in certain moments of their life, like pregnancy, and so in needs of surveillance and regulation. So we shouldn't be naive about the political history of plasticity. My argument is even stronger in a sense that if we want to know the longer history of biopower, we should exactly look at the regulation at the social individual level of corporeal permeability. And this is an argument that I don't know how many of you have an interest in what is called in European theory biopolitics, but you should probably know that the sort of three saints of late 19th century biopolitics, Michel Foucault, Hannah Arendt, and Giorgio Agamben, all share this notion that biopower, biopolitics, the notion of a public collective government of individual and public bodies at their biological and physiological level is just a modern phenomenon. It just came in a significant way only after the 18th century. There is this naive idealization of the Greco-Roman world as a place where bodies weren't governed. You know, if you read this literature, there are reasons why at that time in history they believed that. There is also a reason that there is a new historiography of the Greco-Roman world that wasn't available at the time. But my point is quite different, and is that if you focus on the longer history of medical writings about regulating the permeable body, you would see that the claim that biopolitics is just a modernistic invention, that the interest, collective efforts to promote public health is just a modernistic phenomenon, it's quite wrong. So, of course, I think we should start from the beginning, so to speak. And the beginning is this treatise here on the right, Hippocrates on airs, waters, and places. The title is beautiful. We believe in the environment, you know. We listen to geneticists who say, well, it's only the DNA, and we say as social scientists, but what about the environment? The environment is so important, but what is the environment? This empty box. Hippocrates didn't have a word for environment. The way he understands the environment is through these three different plurals word. Airs, not air, because the whole point of the book is that a doctor should know a lot about geography, because the air you breathe in Athens is not the one you breathe elsewhere, and this has immediate effect on how bodies should be treated. There wasn't a universal view of disease at the time. It was all personalized medicine. It was basically all personalized medicine, microbiomics, because food is mood, and epigenetics at the time, to cut a long story short. So Hippocrates would be a great candidate to win NIH fund today on public health. He would be in the top of the discipline. There are some paradoxes here in the history of science which interest me a lot. So I have sometimes the feeling that I can understand much better Hippocrates, Celsus, or Galen than geneticists like Charles Davenport writing in the early 20th century about the fact that people have wandering genes that are transmitted into family of sailors. You know, there is a strange temporality in the history of science where very ancient notions like this book seems much more up to date if we look at microbiomics, epigenetics, than any geneticist delusion of the early 20th century. So as I was saying, there was not an environment, but there were many things. Airs, waters, places. He could have had the stars, moon. The power of the moon was enormous. So Pliny, the Roman naturalist writer, he claims that when the moon is full, oysters and other aquatic animals change their shape. The effect of the moon on women, period, was a key point of women's regulation at the time. There are also arguments about some women's beauty being changed by the waxing and waning of the moon. Many of these arguments are gendered, many of these arguments are racialized. I'll come to that in a moment. But the point is that now there is not an environment, there are different airs, different waters, different places, and they could have had different stars and different positions of planets in influencing the human body, the human mind. This is another thing where I am really uncomfortable. You can see I'm uncomfortable with many people. I mentioned first Foucault, Arendt, and Agamben. I can mention now post-humanist people. They believe that the history of the West is a major plot of dualistic authors led by René Descartes, and that made of the Western intellectual landscape a major dualistic mind-nature, body-nature war battle. This doesn't make sense historically. If you look at this much longer tradition, a much more influential tradition that shaped the way medicine was delivered to people until the early 19th century, it's quite the opposite. It's very materialistic. Not only places make body, food makes the body, but it makes the mind as well. So there is, for instance, this very famous tradition of the passage of Saturn, provoking the rise of the black bile, and so melancholy in people. Think of the word lunatics. Lunatics come from the Latin luna, moon. The passage of the moon has effect on the size of the brain, and so on mental stability of people. The brain is watery in the Galenic tradition, and the moon is the king of the water. So every time the moon passes, everything that is watery under the earth is shaped by the moon. This is why people are called lunatics, because they are open to the influences of the moon. I don't know, my post-humanist fellow colleagues, where do they study history? I doubt they do at all, unfortunately. And they have this naive belief that the history of the West is dominated by Descartes, who was a transient phenomenon that lasted probably for 80 years, compared to this longer history of materialism. The mid-image is the passage of Saturn having an effect on melancholy and, in general, intellectual activities. That's the connection between even reading. The activity of reading may change humor. It may be dangerous, especially for women, who are more volatile physically than men. And this is, in the other page, the classical representation of the body at the center of different sign of the zodiac, different seasons, etc. So it's this very complex regulation of bodily activity in the context of constant change. There are painstaking description of where you should sleep if you are sad, in a room with not enough light but not too much shadow, what you should eat. If there are painstaking description of what to do if you are having a heavy dinner. You have to do exercise before. You have to play the ball before. You cannot play the ball. You cannot do exercise because it's very winter. You should read loud. Reading loud would prepare the body to a heavy meal. So they are painstakingly careful on what to do with the body and how to govern this openness. So humoralism is the doctrine that the body is composed of a number of elementary fluids whose balance was altered by changes in the surrounding environment. And of course, it implies a view of the body as radically embedded in places. So you might know that today we have a very good friend of mine, anthropologist Margaret Locke, writing on this notion of local biologies. Of course, it's very important to think of local biologies in the plural, in the light of the fact that we have been sold this story of the universal body that is the same everywhere, universal idea of disease, standardized view of medicine and the genome. But again, it's far from being a new idea, the idea of local. I think that ancient people thought only in idea of extremely local biologies. When Galen, who was a rich doctor, urbanite, goes to visit peasants, he doesn't recognize peasants as human beings. I think you might have something like that in the history of Russian literature, where peasants they eat such different food, they do such a different everyday exercise, they live in such a different environmental condition that they're not the same species as we are. They didn't have a shared idea of humanity. You are your place. And you will see how this will be racialized. But anyway, often in medical history is also a bit problematic. They often emphasize maintaining stability in humoralistic argument, but change and metamorphosis are equally important. So the point I would like to make is this. In the 20th century, we believe that biological identity is our starting point, fixed at birth. And then, upon this originary fixedness, we can add a number of social, cultural, biographical layers. Here, it's exactly the opposite. There is biological identity, the temperament, the complexio, but it's something that you reach at the end of a number of micro-practices of the self, and it's always unstable. So there is identity, but it's the final point of a number of regimen, of a number of practices of the self. This is a beautiful late definition of the humoralist body and how humors are changed by environmental changes. As the sea waves, so are the spirits and humors in our bodies, tossed with tempestuous winds and storms. An important point to note is, I don't have time for this, why I don't have this? Okay, it's not here, stupidly, but the word humor, which in Greek is chumos or ikmas, literally means the juice from which plants take nutrition from the soil. Again, for my posthumanist friends, people in the West have believed for centuries that humans were plants. Human exceptionalism may be in some philosophical book, but this notion that people can be transplanted as plants and grow different in different places, I can tell you, you can trace it to Jean Baudin. Notion of racial transplantation are very strong in early modernity. I will give you an example later. But again, what about the idea of human exceptionalism? If the deep understanding of the body was that we were plants attached to the ground, nurtured by the liquid forces of nature, and susceptible to change with a change in place or external condition. I don't know why I don't have this with me here. Now, a body so open to everything that comes around, from the moon that can make you lunatic to Saturn that can make you melancholic, is obviously an anxious body. It's a body always at risk of change, and so in need to regulate change. This is another point that probably is important to highlight. These people were not postmodernists. They didn't believe that constant change was a good thing. They were pretty conservative. Constant change was the best recipe for madness. So if they read like Deleuze today, they would think he was mad. Probably they weren't entirely wrong. But I'm saying that I'm not celebrating ideas of change at the time as some postmodernist message of freedom. Quite the opposite. They were so scared of these constant changes, so they put in practice a number of techniques to regulate this change. So I missed to say, because I'm sort of speaking off with the slides and off with something I'm writing now, but this is also important because the notion of pores, of poroi. So while we know humoralism through this notion of the humors, which I talked about, another key concept I want to convey in terms of understanding the biopolitics of the ancient body is this notion of poroi. So as this author beautifully says, all Greek medical theory is a theory of poroi, a theory of the infinitely penetrable body. So poroi is from where the English word porous comes. So it means really the channels, the paths, the pathways. The Latin would translate this with venas of foramina, so opening, that regulate the exchange between the interior and the exterior of the body. And again, they were not simple-minded people. It's not like saying today plasticity is good. Openness of pores can be very good and very bad. Openness of pores is very important to maintain your body sound because it's the only way you can evacuate the accumulation of noxious humors in the body that are often the result of imbalance in your lifestyle. This is a very moralistic literature that Foucault totally missed, this profoundly normalizing view of the body in the ancient world. He had this aesthetic reading of people in antiquity self-determinating themselves, which, anyway. So open pores can be very good and are the condition for health, because if you have blocked pores, everything that is bad in your body cannot go out, and go out means really evacuation, vomits, sweating. Sweating is the most important activity in the ancient world. There are at least 6 or 7 different words about sweating. Sweating is everything. So having the open pores, often through bathing, hot baths, is essential to eliminate the accumulation of vicious humors. But what if it's a time of pestilence? Having open pores means that pestilence from outside can come easier to your body. So for instance, hot baths were not recommended during time of pestilence. And, so this is the problem of this body, always on the verge of mutation, but always in need to understand how much is the degree of openness, of closeness, that it works well. So he gave rise to a number of techniques that are, very famous. Bloodletting is probably the most famous one, or, the emphasis on purges, blistering, all the kind of techniques through which the body could evacuate, the fear of blocked pores and not be able to evacuate entirely is traced in these medical histories up to the 17th, 18th century. And at the same time, especially later in early modern medicine, it becomes even more the blurring of the boundary between physiological and moralistic arguments become really blurred. So the body is represented as a castle that is under siege, too much food, too much passions, too much emotion, so it has to be controlled, especially in Protestant countries that are known for their understanding of life. This idea of the body as a castle under siege was very strong. And again, I am giving a very Eurocentric account, but humoralism has come to us in the Middle Age as European thanks to the Arab doctors, who were the only one who saved the great tradition of Greco-Roman medicine from destruction. They brought humoralism up to India with Malay medicine. And, so this is a big historical unity of ideas of corporeal plasticity that travels much beyond the West. And then there are a number of striking parallels with other non-Western medicine, like Ayurvedic physiology, in which, again, the body is imagined as an open field, and in which, again, there is a strong botanical comparison, physiological comparison between human and plants. So there are a number of recurring themes: the importance of heat and cold, dry and moisture in regulating the opening of pores. Ayurveda has 3 humors, not 4, but these are minor points. This is not the problem. Okay, but let me come more to the politics of this. So again, we have this. Sorry, I need to drink some. And I'm losing also track of time. Thank you. So we have this a bit naive understanding of plasticity, either in a modernistic way, which is, cosmetic surgery. I'll have a job to change my nose or my face the way I like it. It's very consumerist understanding of plasticity. I'm the master of my body. How much do I need to have a better, nose? I'll pay for that. Or we have, in more postmodernist renderings, this understanding of plasticity as what has really defeated genetic identity, a notion of stability, identity, fixedness. So plasticity become an open-ended possibility to change and become everything. The understanding of plasticity and corporeal permeability in the ancient world is much darker and much more conservative. It's mostly the notion that people are just mirror of their places, and that the ones they have been shaped as a statue, as in plastic arts, by the power of place, although they may change, because this notion of transplantation did exist, the capacity for change was always very difficult and distributed unequally among different races and social groups. So I want to show you here a quick argument of how this idea of the power of places, moralized idea of the power of places, was taken up into imperial arguments. So Hippocrates makes a very, Hippocrates was also a bit of an ethnographer, obviously, because medicine was to go in different places and see different bodies shaped in a differential way, makes this observation that Asians live in a uniform climate, unlike people in the Mediterranean, where there are the 4 seasons and the constant seasonal change. People live in a uniform climate, so they are also morally more uniform. They have no major tendency toward being very aggressive, or they are sort of flat, as flat is their climate, unlike the Greek. But it's an innocent observation. It doesn't want to claim a lot through this. Aristotle takes this point to capitalize on it with a much sophisticated political theory, and he says Orientals, and this is, if you want, the beginning of Orientalism, Orientals lack andreion, manly courage, because they live in this uniform climate. They are not brave enough, they are not good for a certain type of wars, but more importantly, they are naturally subject to a tyrant, and they are perfectly suited to be trained in a government that is based on slavery, which is an argument that you can trace very profoundly, and it starts with this association between climate and people morale. And this changes, so what is in the ancient world mostly an west-east axis become after early modernity mostly a north-south axis. There is this beautiful book by this historian Way Gomez on the tropics of empire, so how Columbus geography reshaped this east-west axis into a north-south axis where people in the tropics, again, were naturally subject to slavery because of their exposure to a certain climate, argument about laziness, etc. But this is a more subtle problem. If you really believe that your body is just your environment, if you don't have a theory of genetic identity or biological fixedness or anything, but in this case you are the conquistador, you are the Spanish colonizers, and you go to the Americas. So what happens then if we go to the Americans? We are under the same stars of indigenous people, we eat the same food, we drink the same water, we breathe the same air. The answer in the history of colonial medicine has a very famous name that has been tracked by so many historians in so many places: degeneration. These people would degenerate and become at some point like Indians. Unless, and that's what this book is mostly about, you, as in the case of Spanish people, constantly feed them with Spanish food, Spanish wine, in order to really maintain racial differences, through a micropolitics of food, eating differentially. And of course, the argument could be turned down into another argument, which indigenous right defenders Bartolomé de las Casas did. If we can maintain racial stability through giving the right food to Spanish colonizers, we can also give Spanish food to Indian people and make them Spanish then. So these ideas were very profound at the time, ideas of racial malleability. I want to say something, and I think we are going. Really? Okay. I want to say something, okay, I've said something about the racialized dimension of corporeal permeability. I want to say something about the gender dimension now. So this is, again, a very ancient idea that has to do with the fact that everyone was permeable and plastic in ancient medicine, but some people were more permeable and plastic than others. And women were certainly one of those cases, especially pregnant women. And this has to do with this long-held notion that I'm sure it must be also present in Russian popular culture. It is certainly in Italian popular culture. I've seen the same in Indian popular culture, of maternal impressions. So the fact that during pregnancy, women's mind can be heavily shocked by the sight of something, and this may be channeled to the physiology of the unborn fetus, so that the unborn fetus is shaped by the experience of the pregnant mother in a direct way. So for instance, in India, they have this tradition, again, all these examples are very racialized, to have pregnant mothers sleeping with the portrait of a white child, because this would sort of help the racial result of the pregnancy. It was famous in the 19th century. Pregnant women went to concerts to listen to classical music, to listen to great novelists in order to shape. And there was an active, what is called nurturist eugenics. There was an active notion, especially on the feminist side of the eugenic movement. So there was this male idea that there were people who were doomed by their faulty genes. That was fought back by this other side of feminist eugenics who would say, yes, but if I marry that guy and during pregnancy I'll do a number of things to shape my heredity in a certain way, I can counteract the force of a faulty gene. So this is a theory, maternal impression, that is, again, very ambivalent. Women are at risk, especially under surveillance in certain periods like pregnancy, but at the same time, their power to shape heredity is unknown to modern medicine. So you probably, I'm not sure how is the situation in Russia about care during pregnancy, but to cut a long story short, in the 20th century, for a number of reasons, which are connected, I think, to the fact that there was, especially in Western countries, an immense increase of access of women to the work market, but also the rise of the genetics view of disease. There was this notion that the fetus was basically a parasite in the female body, which means that it was totally shielded by anything that could happen to a mother. So mothers were regularly given until the 1970s, they were allowed to smoke because not to gain weight during pregnancy, and alcohol as well was not considered so dangerous because it's in a genetic view of disease that everything that really matters is genetically unfolded in the DNA sequence. And what a mother can do is really, really little. It's mostly knowing if there is any defect from the start and decide if go ahead with the pregnancy or not. But the behaviors of mother were largely sidelined in any medical. And these had a number of catastrophic consequences like the thalidomide crisis. Of course, I'm not saying that was good or bad. But I'm saying that this view of mothers as irrelevant, the development of the fetus, and the fetus as a shielded parasite from the maternal body was quite revolutionary against the background of these century-long ideas that mothers were easily shapeable by a number of things and exactly for this reason, they should be taken care of in a certain way so not to expose them to impressions that could leave irreversible mark on the unborn fetus. Here there are a number of, so this is a 17th century book, The Force of the Mother's Imagination Upon Her Fetus in Utero, still further considered. You may think this is a bit boring, probably it is, but you probably don't know that there is in contemporary medicine, a big emerging trend that is called developmental origins of health and disease, which largely refers to epigenetics effects, but not only, also microbiomics, and basically claims that in utero effects are so deep and profound on the unborn fetus and the next generations that mothers are basically in need to control a huge number of variables that were totally unforeseen under the parasite view of the fetus. And also that, what I was saying, sorry. Well, I will say something about that. I'm mentioning this because in the molecular language of 21st century biology, there is an obvious return to the ideas that there is a clear environmental effect during pregnancy that has long-lasting consequences for the fetus and probably even the generation after that, in which the mother is a channel for a number of social environmental effects. That's what I was saying. And this goes back even to the notion of pregestation. So the notion is what some colleague of mine has called to be eternally pregnant. You're not just pregnant when you're pregnant, but in the light of this huge permeability of your body, you are pregnant already when you are 16, because what you do at 16 may have a crucial effect on the physiology of the fetus. And this applies also to father, because there are studies about, for instance, the connection between smoking during puberty and metabolic disorder in children, or connection between smoking and alcoholism in puberty for fathers and schizophrenia. So there are a number of claims about environmental effects being passed from one generation to another. So this is an interesting debate. So you might obviously think that early 20th century eugenicists were just bad people, and they did a number of horrible things, passing sterilization laws among a few of these things. But if you look at the impact of genetics exactly against the background of this debate of what a mother can do, and you compare, for instance, this citation from the book I showed before, The Force of Maternal Imagination Further Considered, 18th century. The mother ought discreetly to suppress all anger, passion, and other perturbations of mind, and avoid entertaining too serious or melancholic thoughts, since all such tend to impress a depravity of nature upon the infant's mind and deformity on its body. This is a classical obstetrician book of the 18th century. And compare this to what these eugenicists and geneticists said in 1915 in the Journal of Heredity, saying the prenatal culturalists and maternal impressionists are trying to place on her, on the mother, a responsibility which she need not bear. Because again, from a genetics point of view, it's basically, it's all set in place in the very first days of the fetus life, the embryo's life, when the mother is even unaware to be pregnant. So this is an interesting way in which this debate was politicized in different angles. I think I just want to conclude saying of what is happening today. So, these are a number of claims that have appeared in the last few years based on this notion that our genomic functioning is profoundly shaped by environmental influences. So we have claims that poverty can leave a mark on the genome of, this is a study about Glasgow, one of the most unequal cities in the United Kingdom. Poverty leaves a mark on the gene of people living in certain areas, and also there is a difference in methylation, which is a key epigenetic mechanism between manual and non-manual workers, or the legacy of bullying. Or this is another study that I find, sorry, it's just the middle, it's this one about low birth weight of contemporary African Americans, an intergenerational effect of slavery. So there is this epidemiological debate about why there is this lower birth weight on average of African American children in the States. And there are arguments about genes, arguments about environment, like stressors, like everyday racism, of course. But this study came out with this notion that they have inherited the long-term influence of the big starvation and physiological stress that slavery was. And no matter the level of nutrition they are receiving today, this is still bearing a mark, so that it results in different in a different birth weight of their children. And there are studies on the Holocaust, on 9/11, pre-pregnancy diet. As I was saying, you are eternally pregnant. It's just not during pregnancy that you should be worried about the long-term effects. And there is this more rosy consumerist view that you go to the gym and you change your DNA, or you can upgrade yourself. So there are lots nowadays of epigenetic companies selling, nutritional enrichment thing with the claim that it changes your epigenetic. Another big thing in epigenetics is what is called the epigenetic clock, which is something that was devised recently at UCLA, and it claims that you can establish a real biological clock looking at epigenetic mutations, which is very different from your chronological age. So to cut a long story short, you have been drinking all your life, you have been living irresponsibly all your life. Hippocrates would say, you are full of bad humors, my friend. You need to take a hot bath and evacuate the bad humors. Instead, this epigeneticist would say, well, you have developed abnormal methylation, and although you are 35, you are biologically 53. And you know who is really interested in this kind of knowledge? Insurance companies. Because before insuring someone, they want to know exactly not only who is this person, but also how he has or she lived. So this is, of course, quite interesting. Again, the notion that inheritance can be poisoned had disappeared from the history of genetics after 1920, when, well, someone who is very related to this country committed suicide in a small place in Austria, Paul Kammerer, the last of the Lamarckians. After that, the notion that you can poison inheritance disappeared, because again, in a genetic view of life, of course, massive nuclear radiation can produce random mutation of some sort, but this is a different argument than lifestyle having a direct impact on biological heredity. But this came back. This is The Economist. Poisoned inheritance, they titled this study about lack of folate in the diet of male mice, reprograms their sperm in ways that damage their offspring. Could the same be true in man? And the fact that the journalists went to this notion of inheritance being poison, if you look at 1920 eugenics, the idea of racial poison was big. It was especially alcohol. Alcohol was deemed to be a major source of racial poison. It means if your parents are drunkards, you are more stupid than other people. That was the point of racial poison. And this is a Glasgow study. Babies born into poverty are damaged forever before birth. I think I will conclude on this note saying this is something I put in my other book. So when I followed this Glasgow study, I was in England at the time, and I had a look at how people reacted to this claim that Glasgow had this huge socioeconomic inequality between different areas of the city, and life expectations in some area of the city is really 20 years below the richest places, but also 5 or 10 years below the poorest area in other cities in the United Kingdom. So there is a bit of this epidemiological mystery about what happens in Glasgow. And when this study was published, that you can have epigenetic evidence that poverty changed the epigenome of people, of course, it was a lot endorsed by charities, NGOs that were saying financial cuts from the government are very bad, we can now have biological evidence. But I read then a letter to the editor on the Scotsman, the local newspaper, by someone who was 80-something. And he said, I think, a beautiful thing. He said, I'm so glad these studies weren't around when I was a child. I grew up in a very poor family that was, very disadvantaged, but my parents were good. I made it through life in a decent way. So he really felt that this power of being stigmatized just because you are born in a bad place, it's really what actually many of these studies convey to people. So this is again to say how open-ended are all of these arguments in the history of biology. And I think we can conclude on this note, where I put into parallel the humoralist view of life and the epigenetic view of life, and of course there are some connections, I think. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maurizio, for that very rich, long-delayed history. Before we open the floor for questions, so please start taking all your questions. Do remember that you use the microphone. I would like to start the discussion by asking you for reflection on maybe how come that this division between genes and environment became so powerful. I mean, you commented very briefly on the card. You showed that how rich this even European and even more when we look at our global history of the body. Medieval historians of medieval times have shown beautifully that our history of the body before modernity and the ways in which we can also explore the historical sources. So I was wondering really how come that, what is your kind of view on how did this distinction get so powerful? And we can also observe that in our own disciplines when we look at what the history and social studies biology have been preoccupied with in the past decades. It's clearly genetics, so that's much more studied also by our own disciplines compared to regeneration, cell culture, and so on. So maybe you can
Well, that's a very good and important question, and I have to say, again, I made this premise at the beginning. When you take this huge overview, I think you gain in some conveying you the feeling of some deep historical process and not being so, naively thinking that everything that happens now is good, is better, is best, is new. So you gain in this, but you lose, I think, in historical accuracy. And I think your comment is very important because I said genetics, but genetics is a big, complex discipline with many different national styles. There are a number of geneticists who studied not only environmental effects, but non-cytoplasmic inheritance, or all things that we would consider epigenetics nowadays in 1910, in 1920, in 1940, in 1950. But I think a few things happened, which at least is more my area of expertise. And so one is that when, this was before genetics came to place, when Weizmann proposed the idea that there is no connection between the germplasm and the somatic cells, so that everything goes from germplasm to germplasm, and nothing that happens at the level of the body can have an influence on heredity. He was counteracting a very widespread view of inheritance of acquired characters. So I think he had to make a bolder case with his famous cutting the tail of 50 generations of mice, showing that at each generation the tail would grow again, so that there was not inheritance. And he made another famous argument and said, look at Jewish people. They have using circumcision for all their lives, and still they have not inherited that. So he made a bold case upon which I think the evolutionary debate was shaped in a certain way. The same Darwin was much more ambiguous about this view of heredity. He believed in pangenesis, which is an Hippocratic idea of somatic cells communicating to germ cells. So I think Weizmann shaped the debate in a way that polarized a bit opinion. But what happened, more importantly, was in 1950 that a very reductionistic view of genetics came into place, which is molecular biology. The central dogma stated in a very bold way, and it was called dogma by Crick and Watson, that there is only one flow of information from DNA to RNA to protein and never back in reverse. And this happened at the time when hard heredity, soft heredity was polarized politically, with Soviet Union capitalizing on idea of inheritance of acquired characters. And there is a beautiful book by Ian Sapp on Beyond the Gene, where he traces the history of American geneticists who in 1950 worked on non-cytoplasmic inheritance and epigenetic effects, where they were seen as suspicious, because this was seen to be very close to Stalinist view of biology. The founder of epigenetics, Conrad Waddington, a British biologist, was translated directly by Lysenko into a local Russian journal. So there were at the time a number of issues around ideas of Cold War. And then there are other points. But I'm saying, your point is very good, it's very correct. The history of genetics is very plural, and I tend to say often that epigenetics is a bit of vindication of sort of minority line in the history of genetics, Richard Goldschmidt's idea of chromatin mutation. So there are a number of, it's a pluralistic history where probably hard line prevailed at some point with this notion, also because there was a strong influence of statistician on the discipline. It's a complex story, but it's a very good point that we need to pluralize the history of genetics. And
okay, the floor is open for discussion, comments, and questions for Maurizio. Who would like to start? Yeah, thank you very much, Maurizio. This is a very challenging and nice narrative, I would say, that indeed reminded us that we have to be a little bit cautious when we're talking about novelty, innovation, new technologies, discovery of new scientific medical products. Now, I suppose that my question is a sort of a follow-up of Suzanne's question, because you suggest to do a long-term history, which is fine. I mean, and we can see indeed a lot of parallels between what happens today, as I say, what happens to ancient theories of the body, of human beings, and so forth. And very, it's very puzzling to think of returning back to something, because so many things happen since then. And as you yourself said, the notion of environment and weathers, Python fires in Palgrave's theory probably say completely different things. So I'm just wondering, well, how can we make sense of these parallels while paying attention to things that happen since the ancient times? Because it's a huge long terrain that you sort of address.
well, yes. When I presented these thoughts to recently in London, there is a very good Foucauldian scholar there who told me, he really looked at me with, compassion, as someone from a much more stupid planet. He told me, how can you trace, there is no unique history of the body and medicine after and before the rise of pharmaceutical industry. If you are a real Foucauldian, you really believe in this notion that there are epistemic break for which you cannot, it's really meaningless to trace a history of plasticity that starts with Hippocrates and joined. But my point is, I think my point is not at the level of molecular mechanism, but it's at the level of form of life. I would say to my Foucauldian commentator, and probably this is not exactly what you were asking me, but I would say to him, we can still understand Aristotle ethics. So there must be some common problematic in the way we adjust ourselves to a number of objective variables that are there that we can name in a different way. But there must be a common history so that we can understand things. So this is one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that I believe, and I don't know if it's clear from this talk, but that the modernistic body of biomedicine, and especially genetics, was a radical break and a radical revolution in the understanding of body world configurations that have been mainstream for centuries all over the world. And this is one of the reasons why indigenous populations in Australia now recognize epigenetics as part of their worldview, because they've always told us that health depends on being in a certain place and being in connection with your ancestors, etc. So the biomedical view of the body, and especially genetics, was a radical revolution, but as all the radical revolutions, is going to lose at some point. What I think I can understand, at least at the level of the popular imagination, is that epigenetics is vindicating long-standing beliefs that have always been there, discredited at some point in scientific circles because of the rise of the genetic body. So my argument is about how strong is really this radical revolution to persist in the light of this number of changes. I don't know if I'm answering exactly what you were asking me. Probably not. But that's okay.
It's more of a discussion, I suppose, when I have listened to you, I think that, well, actually, just to clarify, my question is more about, I suppose, how this modernist body of genetics bringing changes in our understanding today of environmental factors and so on. Because a revolution, as you say, is always a radical break. So I'm just wondering, what does it mean to recover something that happened in ancient times after such a radical break and such a radical revolution? And certainly, the radical theory of modernist genetic body had produced something in our understanding of what is the environment, which maybe is not exactly what the Prime Apparatu's theories is suggesting. So I suppose my question is more how this radical genetics view that probably lasted just a few decades in certain very specific areas of research, bring in a new definition, a different definition of the environment, which probably is prevalent today, but which might be different from the definition of the ancient times, especially because the notion of the environment didn't exist before.
Yeah, I don't think we can go into. I think it's a good question, but my point, just to clarify, is that the Hippocratic view of the environment has declined not in a major label environment, but into specific airs, waters, and places, is resonating with notions of local biologies that are driven by research in environmental epigenetics and microbiomics today. Whereas, the universal standardized view of the biomedical body, just to simplify in a way that can be really painstaking, you have a standardized, as you have a standardized body, you have a standardized environment through which a number of factors of exposures would produce differential result on the way in which genetic expression would work. So a same gene in different environment, gene-environment interaction will produce different phenotypes. You have a gene for mental health problems, you live in a nurturing family, you are okay. You have a gene for mental health problem, you live in a stressful environment, unlike other people without that gene, you would become a person with problems. But this is different than claiming that you are the problems of your family. Your genomic expression is the incorporation of that environment. It's still a relation of antagonism between genes and environment, statistically tracked, which is different from saying that I am literally fed. I am really, what is under my skin is the environment of this or previous generations. So these are two different views. One maintains stability of identity and mechanism of regulation. The internal milieu is what matters in modern medicine. Claude Bernard as well is very strong on this. He's saying the Hippocratic imagination was all about external environment. What really matters is that we have a regulating device into us. That's what really counts. I think it is in that track that modern biomedicine came to be important, and I think it's a fantastic miracle, intellectually speaking. It's a major radical break. It's like the Protestant Revolution. I wonder how did they make it? You know, because they were really radical, sort of, you know, and they had to take bold positions. All of them did. The first geneticists, you know, they didn't have patience for Lamarckism and inheritance of acquired characters. Today, I think biologists are saying, well, wait a second. After the revolution, you start looking at things and see they are more complex. And maybe you want a bit of market economy, not just socialism, or vice versa. You can understand that, you know, that radical statement was probably underestimating a number of factors. And then there is to add, sorry, just to conclude, that this is the Anthropocene age. Everyone is talking about toxic exposures. So this kind of biology, I think, is also very resonating, this biology of airs, waters, and places, with the notion that we are on a fragile planet. And, you know, I think this is also, unlike the modernistic fantasy of a body that can cross spaces. Anyway, sorry, it's a long answer.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk. I want to ask if it seems to me that the way you compare ancient traditions, traditions, it seems that you pick up this neural theory and compare it to modern knowledge, epigenetics. What about other knowledge traditions, for instance, shamanic, spiritual healings, supernatural belief that there are certain powers that are extra to human body? Because these are, in medical anthropological terms, you can say that these are more like naturalistic. What if you compare it to a more personalistic health system? Do you see any parallel, or can it be also applicable to other? Or it just, you know, because the ancient wisdoms are vast, you can pick up things that are similar, but maybe there are other things that are quite contrary to what you've been saying.
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you. Well, first of all, I would say, well, Hippocrates, among the competing medical schools of the time, is known for being the founder of what is called rational medicine, because they really gave little power to supernatural powers. Although, I mean, the Roman, when there was an epidemic, they sacrificed animals as first answer to the problem. So they had a pluralistic approach to medicine. They built aqueducts, suggested to go to do exercise and sacrifice animals. So they had a pluralistic approach to medicine. That's the first part of the answer. But the second part of the answer is that let's take seriously a symmetry principle about human beliefs and not a modernistic one. If you read popular and scientific literature about the power of genes in the 20th century America, especially at the time of the Human Genome Project, gene, warrior gene, schizophrenia gene, is this any different from the supernatural powers you were mentioning before? I mean, I think that this is a supernatural view of life where you are the carrier of a transcendent message that is replicating. I mean, when Deakin said that we are just replicators of a selfish DNA, isn't that a supernatural view of a mystical force that is guiding us to be selfish? And and rape women, because if a man stays 8 hours on a plane full of women, has a natural genetic tendency to sexual assault them, to propagate his genes. I mean, isn't that a supernatural view of life? I don't think there is a major difference with, so I think there was a belief in the power of something that escapes, rational investigation, and the attribution of a source of behavior to something within us, which to me has always looked very mystical. So I don't know. I'm a believer in the symmetry principle. So although, as people would say, I still prefer to fly with a real airplane than with, some healer that recommends me to fly to Rome tomorrow flying on a bird. I still prefer a real airplane, so I still prefer modern engineering. But in terms of judging a belief, I think that there should be some sort of symmetry and be open to the idea that also we had cultivated notions of supernatural powers in our scientific discourse of some sort.
Yeah, first of all, thanks. That was hugely inspiring. I'm not sure if you see yourself as a historian, perhaps partially, but I was wondering, what do you see could be the role of historians in developing this narrative that you propose here, and sort of further challenging the status quo?
Right. Well, I do see myself as a historian. The question is how historians would look at me. That's probably the question. I see myself as an impure historian, I would say. Well, I don't know. I think, so you're asking this professionally as a historian. So what do you think? I'm more curious to hear your answer than actually. So what would you think of this kind of grand narrative and grand sketch? I mean, I know that this goes a bit counter against the grain of what especially medical history is about. I don't know. What are your feelings?
As I said, I think it was hugely inspiring. So I'm not sure what the overall perception of it was. So for example, you mentioned a couple of things of what people would say. And I myself am not that concerned because you consciously choose the wrong domain narrative and you realize and recognize your limitations. My experience is actually in the history of emotions in the body, so I'm not a medical history person in a narrow sense. And I think a lot of this resonates in the kind of debates I have with psychologists who also have recently come to very plastic understanding of the brain, for example. And it also resonates with a lot of what we could say about the nature of emotions in the history of emotions, for example. Something which sounded really crazy, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, is actually becoming almost mainstream. So I think it's very interesting parallel to what you demonstrate here with epigenetics and history of the body, let's say. But I'm curious as to what kind of subjects should we tackle. So if we really go deep into a particular topic, what would that be? And for example, I'm just looking at the slide here and the number of different components which influence it. Epigenetic modulation, right? So it could be studies of, as you mentioned, like diet, and there are lots of cases, not just in the Dutch case of the Second World War, of course. Or you can look at drugs or exercise. And then I think it's a really big challenge how to conduct a historical study in a way that is meaningful and the results are meaningful for a broader audience.
Well, thank you. I mean, as for the first part, I mean, about historians. So I remember when I presented my other book at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, and I had this very simplistic quadrant of left Mendelian, right Mendelian, left Lamarckian, and right Lamarckian, which is a way, I think, to pluralize the history of eugenics, and I think it has been helpful, especially for social science. And a number of historians there started to, say, but what about this author? What about this? I mean, there are a number, of course, when you have this sort of infrastructure in knowing historical period, they would point to a number of authors who wouldn't fit exactly that square division. Nonetheless, I believe that as a social theorist, it's helpful to give people a sense that there were competing narratives in eugenics. And sometimes if you only study, I mean, it's a matter of scale. I think that my contribution is one way of mapping things that is not going to replace a detailed map of the leaf on a tree. But if it gives people a feeling that there is a continent there, I don't think people can challenge the notion, and someone will probably tell me that there is no continent. It's your illusion to look at things from far side. Fair enough, but if this has generated an inspiring and dynamic conversation, I'm happy with what I'm doing. So.
Okay, we do have time for more questions, so please continue thinking about questions. So we have like 4 or 5 more minutes, and I would like to join back into the conversation and take it up on like the incredible richness of the historical sources, and also for like social scientists, anthropologists, like the rich social worlds and relations that we have. So I think it's also time to think about the research questions that we want to pose, and I mean that's also why we always have to reread and rewrite history in a way that we did not stop like doing history or studies of social relations in a very broad sense. And I mean, your talk has been for me also contributing to that inspiration of maybe rethinking the obsession with genetics in the history and social studies of biology, and opening up also for like different kinds of research questions to understand our contemporary moment when we see this rise of plasticity thinking in a lot of disciplines, like psychology was just mentioned, but also complexities thinking, system thinking in many other disciplines, and to understand like kind of the epistemic infrastructures of biology, and then also of our own kind of ways in which we follow these and are sometimes, bound up in these kind of narratives or divisions and separations like between the biological and the social, and then we had to coin this notion of biosociality, or nature cultures as the Haraway had it. And so thinking about together about the kinds of questions that are relevant in our contemporary moment. And you also mentioned power, economics, insurance. Others? Yeah, Sasha.
Thanks a lot, Maurizio, for I really like this idea of plasticity of the body and this porous pathways between the inside and the outside. I just wanted to make like a quick very contribution from our research with geneticist that has just started last summer in Moscow. So it's really, I feel like it's both geneticists and patients have a hard time thinking of genetics and outside the genome. So basically, one case, a patient was asking about whether there is any dietary recommendation that a doctor would give her to reduce the chance of like another occasion of breast cancer. And the geneticist really couldn't answer that question because how to talk about genetic things in like non-genetic, how do you know genetic recommendations in her positions, right? And also for the patient, on the patient side, this like more popularity and the genes can't be changed. It's really kind of an obstacle for doctors to attract more patients to genes can be changed, I think is a more widespread, for now at least in what we observe now, field work.
Well, of course, I mean, I don't have a sort of general answer. I think it's very important to have this kind of local conversation. There are local style in science, so and each lab is different, each leader investigator is different. I've been around epigenetics for 10 years and I've seen that there is a generational gap. The younger the scientists, the less they are sort of into that old Cold War notion that soft heredity is dangerous. There is also a gender divide. Evelyn Fox-Keller has pointed out that epigenetics, non-cytoplasmic inheritance is more sort of a female understanding of biology as a dynamic development rather than the master centralized view of the gene. But why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because, well, I'm not sure, but when you said the doctor didn't have a recommendation, right?
Basically, she was saying that she read on a blog, or a popular blog, that there are certain types of diet.
Yeah, sure.
This paper petitions for development of genetic, but that until
Yeah.
we get that.
Right, but think also how liberating is this message, right? Compared to that kind of literature I was telling you where you have to control your emotions, passions, what you see, what you experience, what you eat, and you are constantly anxious about your blog posts. I mean, that was the modernistic side of genetics. Basically, look, unless you go through X-ray and nuclear radiation, you are fine, right? Or just check that you don't have any faulty gene in you, but once you have done that, there are a number of things that have no genetic impact that we can easily recognize. Even established that tobacco was had significant impact on genetic mutation took a lot. And so this view of the bounded body, I think it was, for most people, was taken as good news. As Alfred Russel Wallace said, the co-founder of evolution, the idea that considering how much war and famine and violence there have been all around the world, the notion that we are not inheriting characters from the previous generation is very good news. So I think there was a liberating side in this notion. You can't do much. We have seen always the fatalistic side of the which of course it does exist, but is it also this sort of emancipatory side, especially for women, I think.
Okay, I think we need to come to a close. If there are no urgent comments, questions, remarks that you would like to share, then I would like to thank you all for participating in the discussion. It's been inspiring.